So I'm going to be talking about key language teacher competencies in the 2020s, something that I've been thinking about ever since 2018 when I was here, and what we face as teachers, the way we move through our professional journey, through our lifelong learning as teachers. But I want to start by saying this is not a suggestion of a new framework for teacher quality. This is a very personal take on some of the challenges, some of the interesting opportunities that I've seen develop over the last few years, and which I think will be a feature of our work as teachers, particularly as language teachers, as we move through this exciting, unprecedented, unknown decade. And I want to think about teacher competencies as something that teachers do for themselves, often by themselves, often with others, but not something that's done to teachers. Teachers are responsible for their own development. You can't develop somebody else. You can only develop yourself. And we know that when we embark on professional development opportunities, obviously I'm preaching to the converted here, by your presence in this room, you're engaged with your own professional development, but often we feel differently as we move through professional development opportunities and experiences. And over the last few years, you may have felt differently. You may see yourself in some of the characters in the bridge, particularly with reference to your emergency response to the coronavirus pandemic, times when you felt you've had the resources, times when you felt this has been a successful journey that you've taken with colleagues, times when you felt you don't know if you're heading in the right direction, times when you felt you haven't even been able to get started because of the resources available to you. So we know that every teacher's journey is different, and every teacher will face challenges. So as we go through this presentation, I want you to think, where would you situate yourself at the moment in the development of your own competencies? Hopefully not too many people are feeling like this, certainly not on day 2. Hopefully you're feeling you're going in the right direction, but we know that many of our colleagues may feel resistant to teach development opportunities, may feel restricted in the opportunities available to them. So where do you situate yourself as we move into the 2020s? But I'm not going to start in the 2020s. I'm going to take you back 150 years to begin with. Anybody got? No, nobody's got actual memories of 150 years ago. I'm sure of that. But 150 years ago, and I was talking to Michelle, our colleague who's speaking in the French strand last night, and I was thinking about Jules Verne. And back in the late 19th century, he was writing his Voyages Extraordinaires, 55 novels, imagining the future, imagining the world around him and what possibilities he saw for the world in the late 19th century. And he inspired some French artists to reflect on what they thought from their position at the turn of the century, from the 19th to 20th century, what they thought life would be like when we entered the 21st century. And one artist did a picture like this. They thought this would be the future of taxi travel in the world as we enter the year 2000. And he did, different artists did different pictures of different aspects of life and society. Pictures of architecture, pictures of travel, pictures of home life. And one artist, an artist called Wilmard, did a picture of his conception of what education would be like in the 21st century, from his perspective back at the turn of the 19th to 20th century. So just close your eyes a minute. Imagine you're back in the early 1900s. What do you think a conception of education in the 21st century would be? Well, here's what Wilmard suggested. It's quite a dystopian vision, isn't it? The students wired in. The teacher reduced to mere content provider. The one without the access, unable to take part in the learning. Is this where we've come to? Is this what we face? Or is this something that is merely a fantastic representation of imagination? Well, what I think we need to do is to take some agency for this and think about how we can push back, how we can be empowered as teachers to make our own pictures of classrooms as we enter the third decade of the 21st century, and not be overwhelmed or misrepresented by things that are going on around us, and to take agency for our own development and our own actions and the way we work with teachers in the classroom. So I'm going to present to you 5 competencies which I think are important for teachers going forward. But these are my competencies, and I hope one thing this does for you is to provoke challenge in you, to think, well, no, I don't agree with these. These wouldn't be in my list. These wouldn't be in my 5. And I'm sure that Sarah would probably include teacher agency in their own well-being in her list of key competencies. And Chia would probably include cultural awareness, understanding, and flexibility in her competencies. But I'm going to take 5 aspects which I think are important for professional development and development opportunities for teachers in this decade. On the posters at the front here, we have a quote from Confucius. Now, my German's pretty appalling, but Uwe did translate this for me yesterday, the importance of communication as the meaning, but I'm going to go with another Confucius quote. It says, "A common man marvels at uncommon things, the things that are amazing and awesome, but a wise man marvels at the commonplace, the things that are around us all the time, perhaps the white space around the blue dot in Sarah's representation yesterday." And one thing I think this really has import for us as language teachers, and it may be a very obvious competence, is to keep our thirst for knowledge and our thirst for awareness of language and language change and the way that language moves and evolves. And we know that this might be diachronic change, historic change in language. The language of English didn't look the same 700 years ago in Chaucer's Middle English as it does today. You may recognize some words here. You may recognize some phrases, some grammatical structures, but there'll be things there that you think, I couldn't make head or tail of that now in my classes. Fortunately, we don't have to in our everyday life unless you're studying Middle English. And we can have translations. I'm sure ChatGPT could do a good representation of what this is like now. For those of you who are particularly interested, this is a kind of modern translation. You can see that some of those phrases have maintained, some have changed their spelling, some have disappeared from our language completely. And this is obviously Chaucer's more bawdy side, one of his tales representing the... and it's not about the socks that were thrown on the floor in this case, I don't think. I don't think that was the contract that Chaucer was talking about. So we have this historic change of language which we need to be aware of, and this is also supported by embracing other varieties of English, dialectical changes in how we embrace English as a global language, the different varieties of English, the different Englishes in the world. Here's one from the Scottish author Irving Welsh, and you can see whilst there's much similar structure, there are different words and different pronunciations there, and you need to read it aloud to see that change. So we need to be aware of language change diachronically. We need to be aware of language change that's influenced by other parts of society, by the influence of technology, by the changes in society. But we also need to be aware of the way that language evolves as a choice. And I think this is particularly important when we enter a decade, and particularly this last 6 months to 8 months, where we enter a world where we're never really sure whether a human has written the language that we're processing, or a human has produced this, or whether it's been scraped from pieces of language that exist in the World Wide Web. And so we need to be aware of this change in terms of how we can make language a choice. And language is always going to be a choice. And I think teacher awareness of language as choice is critical. Being able to understand the subtleties of when we make choices of how we produce language, we're making decisions and we're taking ownership of that language. We're not allowing a machine to make those choices for us, but we're developing our own idiolects and giving our own sense of meaning to words. So the difference between these two forms of reporting speech, there's no difference in the meaning there, but there's a difference in the way I want you to understand my relationship with you, my relationship with the events that I'm talking about. The grammar reference books, of course, will tell us what we know about reported speech, that we use a reporting verb and that we move one tense back and that it all looks very ordered. But actually, when my children talk, The reporting verbs are very different. He goes and he's like, and they go like this, and it looks very different. And there's lots of slang, and there's direct speech within the reporting speech. And so we get this language as choice. We get these options to tell people much more than we're saying with the actual words, but we're saying the implications of what I'm saying about my relationship to you, my relationship to my audience. And it can be in reporting speech. It can also be grammar as choice. What are the differences when we decide to use a particular structure in our language? Well, we're talking about how I see myself in relation to the events, the likelihood of the possibility here. I got in a lot of trouble with my partner, the mother of my children, when she first told me she thought she might be pregnant. And I said, well, if you were pregnant, and she looked at me with daggers in her eyes, and I realized I shouldn't have used the second conditional, putting it into a hypothetical conditioning. I should have said, if you are pregnant, then it's a real possibility, and we'll deal with it. But I made that choice, and I gave an implication just by the choice of the grammar that I'd used in that. And that awareness, that subtlety, the nuance of language can get us in trouble. We can emerge from that trouble if we're lucky. But when we're making those choices, we're making choices that artificial intelligence can't make for us, because it's artificial and it's not really intelligent. So when we're making choices with our language, we're telling people, how do I see myself as distant from the events I'm describing? How do I see myself as distant from the people I'm talking about? How do I imbue my words with the emotions that are relevant to the situation? How much responsibility do I take for what I'm telling you about? Is this my words? Are these my thoughts? Am I merely the conduit for somebody else's thoughts? How much assumption is there of the shared knowledge between us? How much do I assume that you know and that we can talk about together? And how much do I want to tell you of the subtext, the intention of what I'm trying to convey? So all these things give us language as choice. But are we teaching language in the right way? I mean, let's look at ways in which language is described. I'm sorry this is a bit text-heavy, but I'm going to give you a moment to look at these two descriptions of how language is used and language is learnt. Do you think they seem quite similar in their processing of what language learning and language use is all about? I think there are huge similarities in here. The second one is a description of how AI processes language, using the input data to predict what's coming next. When we expose to different language, we learn grammar, context, and meaning, or the machines learn grammar, context, and meaning. The first one says, we process language, we activate the strategies, we monitor these, we get better, we modify our competences. The second one, the description of AI, the first one comes from the Common European Framework of Reference. It's describing how humans learn languages. So these similarities between what we're doing if we embrace the concepts in the Common European Framework, the ways in which we help our learners to learn language and help our learners to use language, very similar, and has been taken by the computer scientists as the model generating language for these large language models. So perhaps we're not too far away from our conceptualization of language and language learning and language processes, and we need to hold on to that, because the teacher agency that's suggested in the Common European Framework has been adopted by others as the appropriate way for natural language processing to work. So my first suggestion is that language awareness is going to continue to be and will remain the fundamental competence amongst language teachers. That real tuning in to the nuances and the subtleties of language is what is the knowledge of our subject. And we should hold on to that, and we should hold dearly onto that, because protecting that against text generated by computer and striving for language production to be in the hands of those learners who imbue it with meaning versus an artificial generation of language is going to be central to our work in the coming years, I believe. Which leads me on to the second key competence, which is about the challenges we've faced and we continue to face with the advent of different forms of digital literacy. Now, some of these aspects were forced upon us. The emergency response, the shift to online learning, the ways in which we had to adapt to working remotely with learners, working online with learners. Some people perhaps were even in the incredibly challenging situation of having to work in hybrid context where you had simultaneously learners in the room and learners online, and how this challenges the very essence of teaching and learning. And some of these things we've held on to as we've emerged from the pandemic. Some of these things we've said, actually, that wasn't a great response here, and I don't want to do that anymore, thank you very much, no matter what you say. But of course, the elephant in the room of digital literacy is now the advent of artificial intelligence and the way in which we respond to that. And some people have responded very fast. There are people within the last 6 months who will tell you everything you need to know as a teacher to use AI, everything that you need to learn. You can do a course on this, you can be the perfect AI-empowered teacher. Now, I think it's far too early to make these claims, and things are going to change very fast. I think, actually, we need to be taking stock and looking at the affordances, but looking at the challenges, and being very careful of anyone who tells you they have all the answers to this. There are already some scare stories coming out there. Be careful if you use AI to tell you which mushrooms to choose. The doomsayers of what's coming around the corner. Everyone on earth could fall over dead in the same second, if you believe some of these headlines. And then in our educational world, is AI the threat to the entire traditional learning? Well, of course, 100 years ago, Thomas Edison was saying, motion pictures, moving pictures, will change traditional education as we know it. It will never be the same again because we have motion pictures. So we've had, historically, claims of it's the end of traditional education. But I think we need to be positioning ourselves in a position of empowerment, in a position of understanding of the opportunities here. And one of the things that we've heard about quite a lot is the importance of what we tell a chatbot, what we tell a large language model in terms of what we're going to get out of it. So I think one of the things that's going to come in our competencies is something we might call prompt literacy. The ways in which we can decide how we ask for information, how we ask for language to be generated by these models. And we're all familiar, I'm sure, with Bloom's taxonomy. But where is prompt literacy going to fit into this? Well, I think there will be different types of prompt that we use to make the AI work for us, to make the AI work for our learners. There will be prompts that we write which ask for the very basic, lower-ordering thinking skills, that we ask to generate very basic information. But can we also use AI to generate supportive, AI-empowered human actions at the higher-order thinking skills? Now, work is already going on this. You can see, I'm not going to put it up for too long, but Oregon State University is already looking at this interface between what the AI might do in terms of AI's capabilities and what are the human skills which need to support that. And at each level of Bloom's taxonomy, this idea that we can design, create prompts which get the information we want that capitalize on the very humanness which Bob was talking about yesterday. So we need to be sensitive to these developments, and I think we need to develop this prompt literacy as a teacher working in this third decade of the 21st century. But we also need to be very cautious because there's a real danger of teacher overload and an overload of teacher expectations. And we saw this in the last decade when the dominant aspect of digital literacy was mobile learning and app-based learning. And very quickly, we saw things like this. 2017, this was already the 5th version of the pedagogy wheel. Guess what, teachers? There's 188 suggested educational apps you can use in your class. Make sure you know at least 187 of them by Monday, and you'll be fine. And there's absolute overload on teachers, an overwhelming expectation that any teacher could possibly have this kind of command. And of course, this is 2017, and many of these don't even exist anymore. Some have maintained. But the implication of this for teacher professional development, teacher competence, is just overload. It's all innovation without consolidation, without it percolating through to practice. And we're already seeing some of this in the last 6 months. So this one scared me when I saw it the other day. Here we are. Bored of ChatGPT yet? Here's 120 other AI tools. And you'd be right to sigh. Because this kind of expectation on teachers for an aspect or digital literacy as a competence, it's all about the volume, all about the quantity, and nothing in there of the quality. And yes, there may be an AI for anything we need to do, but where are we going to position ourselves as teachers to take the best and make sure we're making the right decisions for our learners and for our professional practices? So we've got to be very careful in our digital literacy to make sure it's not all innovation without consolidation, and to position ourselves that we think that actually the work we're doing is appropriate to the tools, emphasizing our humanness and the interactions we have in the classroom, and not here's a scorecard for how many AI-based tools you can show you can use to your senior teacher, your manager, or your inspector, whatever it is. So those are the challenges in terms of digital literacy. Not too much, I hope, for the first two. The third one I want to suggest is one very dear to my heart, and it's all about teachers and assessment. So because it's teachers and assessment, let's start with a test. Are you ready for your first test? It's a multiple choice test, you'll be fine. Simple question: which tree is the biggest? Which tree is the biggest? Come on, you've only got 30 seconds for each multiple choice question in my 100-question multiple choice test. Well, absolutely. The only possible response to this is, it depends. Well, it depends what you mean by biggest. It depends whether you're talking about the size it occupies in space. It depends whether you're thinking about the height. It depends whether you're thinking about the girth. It depends whether you're thinking about the depth of roots. And if we take an analogy to language there, we might say, well, this one has the most pieces of language, but this is the highest on a proficiency scale. This is the most breadth of language. This one has the deepest roots in understanding. But of course, if we knew how we define biggest, we could do this with a tree, but language doesn't sit still. Language moves and changes within an individual over their journeys. So we have to be able to define what we want to know when we ask the question, which tree is the biggest? And this is one of the challenges for teachers and assessment. How do we know we're asking the right questions? How do we know that it's a question, if a student doesn't pass our question, that it's the student failing the assessment rather than the assessment failing the student? Because some things we know to be true, I think. This quote sometimes attributed to Einstein, but the first reference in the literature I found was to Cameron in 1963. Not everything that can be counted is important. Just because we can do a 100-item multiple choice test, does that mean that counting those things is what we should be doing? And how do we measure those other aspects? How do we measure somebody's motivation? How do we measure somebody's aptitude or enthusiasm for the language? These things count in language learning, but trying to put numbers to them is at best impossible and at worst harmful. And also, as language teachers, we know that when people say, come on, it's not rocket science, we know it's actually a lot harder than rocket science. What we have to do is trying to describe really complex phenomena, the interaction of first language and second language and third languages in the brain. And not only do we have to do that, we have to do that in a small number of words, because we're talking to teachers and we're talking to parents and we're talking to other stakeholders. And so we have to use words that they understand. And the theory's evolving all the time. As we understand more about how the brain processes language, the theory is developing on first language acquisition and second language acquisition. So we have to do this. It's a real challenge for language teachers when we try to describe what an assessment might mean. But there's a third reason I think assessment is a challenge for teachers. And to illustrate this, I'm going to introduce my son. This is my son, Luke, and he's about to undergo a short learning experience. And like Cheers Husband Socks, I've used this video before, so if you have seen it before, don't give away the game. But I'm going to ask you to watch a very short learning sequence with my son and answer 3 questions for me. Okay, the first question is, what's the target language? Okay, not the big, is it English or Spanish or French? That'll be very easy. But what's his teacher trying to teach him? What are the actual focus of this lesson? Second question, are there any aspects of good pedagogy you see in this? Is there anything you think, okay, that's good learning practice or that's good teaching practice? And the third question is, when does teaching turn to testing? Okay, so what's the target language? What's he trying to learn? Are there any things that you think are positive here? And when does teaching turn to testing?
A yellow one. Get a green one, Lukey. A green one. Can you find a green one? Look, here. Here's a green one. Oh, that's a yellow one. Can you get a green one now? Yeah, good boy. Another green one. That's good. And a yellow one. Now a yellow one. No, that's a green one. A yellow one. The other colour. There's the other colour. There, yellow one. Good. What colour's that, Lukey?
Okay. So, very quickly, we know the drill. When the hand goes up, you stop. But with the person next to you, can you answer those 3 questions between you? Thank you very much. So, don't be too hard. Yeah. He's only 2.5 in this video. What was the target language? What was he trying to learn there? Colours more specifically? Yellow and green. 2 years old, developmentally appropriate? Yeah, okay, we think we're not overburdening him with that challenge. Okay. Anything you liked about the learning sequence? Anything that you thought was positive, good representation of what we know about how learning happens in learners?
He was happy.
Happy, yes, it was through play, he was happy, he was smiling, yeah. There's lots of feedback, wasn't there, yeah? A mixture of praise and encouragement and remedial feedback, yeah? Anything else? Learning by doing, absolutely, yeah. Using the body, using other senses, having a physical task to complete. Yeah. No fear of error. Yeah. Lots of praise, lots of task repetition. He could see when it was going, he could see there was an end to this. Yeah. There was a purpose, self-directed learning. All of these things we believe as good pedagogy. So the third question was, when does teaching turn to testing? Anybody pick out a test question? What was the last thing his teacher said to him? What colour's that one at the end? So we've reached the top of the pile. You've had your learning experience. Now it's time for the test. What colour's that one? Okay. Bear in mind, this is my son. He's put the last one on there. He's got a question. Is he going to get the test right? Is he going to say the right answer to this question? What do you think? Well, it's 50-50. Yeah. You're very harsh. Let's hear his response.
What colour's that, Lukey?
Red.
Yeah. Yeah. This is why teachers don't like assessment, isn't it? All of this good pedagogical practice, and we get to the test, and there he is. And I think, where on earth did that come from? Where on earth? Well, there's possibly lots of reasons where that came from. Maybe he's got an association between colour and red. Yeah? We talk about, look at the red bus, look at the red ball. We get this, maybe he's got this lexical priming, and that's his immediate response. Maybe he's not ready for that. We know that input doesn't equal acquisition and be ready for output at the speed that a teacher wants, so maybe he's just not ready for that. Maybe it will come later. And he did insist, he said, everyone in Austria is going to think I'm stupid, so he did insist that I show this.
This is yellow. This is green. And this is red.
So, they get there eventually, yeah. But we haven't got the time in our educational syllabuses, and we've got to do these tests, we've got to do these formulaic tests. So I think actually it's his mum's fault. Yeah, I would say that. Why is it his mum's fault? Well, let's think back. What was the first question? What was his target language? Well, it was green and yellow. Yeah, and we had all this pedagogical practice, all this good learning, and then we came to the test, and the question was, what colour's that? So he's not only got to know that green and yellow are two things that we call colours, this superordinate section, but he's got to then relate that question about colour back to something that he hasn't been covering. So actually, the test question was really unfair. If he'd been asked, is that yellow or is that green, I'm sure he'd have got it right. I'm 100% sure. Yeah? So actually, it's a case of the assessment failing the student rather than the student failing the assessment, because we were asking the wrong question for the things we taught, and it's really easy to do. We can fall into that trap. And students will always surprise us because they're endlessly creative. When we look at a maths question, we think, okay, well, that's a reasonable test in a test paper. Well, you were this student, perhaps, who decided this is the way I'm going to name the quadrilaterals. And I love the student's name at the top. I'll have a good one. So, quadrilateral. And it continues as students get older. In the history test, where was the American Declaration of Independence signed? Well, of course, it was signed at the bottom. This is what we hope. Yeah. How many points are you going to give for this? So we have this challenge of teachers with knowing that the questions we ask are going to elicit the answers we want, or elicit the student's opportunity to demonstrate their competences, their abilities, their proficiency. And we also have this challenge in this decade, I think, of knowing that there are things that we want to encourage, these life skills in the classroom that we want to really focus on, and we want to develop their creativity, we want to develop their ability to work together, because we know these things are going to be important in the world outside the classroom, and particularly want to develop their digital literacy and the way that they use other sources to respond in learning and assessment situations. But of course, in our standardized world, when we use all of these skills in a test, we call this cheating. So, big challenges for teachers' assessment literacy, an ongoing challenge to make sure the questions we ask are actually reflecting the learning that's happening and the students' abilities that we want to see. So, we have assessment literacy as the third competence. The fourth competence might surprise you a little bit, and I'm only going to spend a couple of moments on this. This is one of the classrooms at Nile. And one of the things hiding in the corner over here is a little box. This little box here looks like this. And this is called an aware device. It's something that I've got really interested in the last 5 or 6 years. It's developed by a professor called Stephen Heppel. And it reads the learning environment. It looks at the aspects of the classroom environment which might be affecting learners in ways we don't always see, or perhaps ever see. It looks at the temperature in the classroom, the humidity, the levels of carbon dioxide. It looks at the pollution, it looks at the external noise, and it looks at the light levels in the classroom over the working day. And it's actually fascinating to see the times within a school day when the light levels are just not appropriate, that students drop down because they don't have enough light, that the CO2 is so high that there's no way you could concentrate. You wouldn't have that in an industry setting, you wouldn't have that level of carbon dioxide, that the temperature is too high or too low to make this conducive to learning. And all these kind of invisible factors, forget the methodology, if learners aren't in a position where they can physically function in the learning environment, that's something we need to have responsibility for. And particularly in this world when we're often dealing with learners in a remote setting where they're responsible for their own environments. How can we encourage them to be aware of the light levels and getting enough oxygen and staying hydrated when they're learning? Because these things will affect learning, and all of the studies that Professor Stephen Heppel's done, and please do Google him if you're interested in knowing more about this, say that, as temperature increases, performance decreases linearly, direct relationship, and very possibly causal relationship, very probably causal. That when the light levels are not appropriate, the focus cannot happen amongst learners. When there's not enough oxygen in the room, learners cannot focus, their brains do not work in the same way. And he goes as far as to say, if you want your child to do well at school, tell them to sit near a window and open it. Yeah? And these two things will make as much difference as many of the other aspects of learning proficiency. So I think we do need to have an awareness of the physical learning environments that we're in control of, and what we can do to open windows, to check light levels, to make sure that there are breaks and times when the doors open. And you'll know, when we go out for coffee breaks, we all stretch, and actually we're all benefiting from a different set of air. It's not just because we need our caffeine hit, it's about that different environment that we're in. So I think that a literacy of learning environments is something we can be aware of and we can develop, not necessarily with a machine to do this, but with the awareness of the impact on learners of an unsuitable learning environment. And so my final suggestion is to forget language. This is my colleague Phil Ball, and he's a CLIL expert. I'm sure many of you are comfortable with the term CLIL, the content and language integrated learning, and the new derivations of it, CLILling, and to be CLILified, as we were using in the bar the other day. But the idea here is that I think the boundaries have blurred from when teaching English as a subject was its own separate aspect, and when teaching content and language together was a different discipline. I think those boundaries are continuously blurring, and we know that language is the vehicle to content. It's not like this poor child wishing that education could take place. Unfortunately, learning of content doesn't happen in this way, unless there's an AI for that. And we wish sometimes it did. We wish it was as easy as that. But no, language is our vehicle to content, and content is our vehicle for learning language. And so those boundaries, I think, have blurred. And we know that some of the lessons we can learn from the research into CLIL about balancing the procedural demands of a task and the linguistic demands of the task and the cognitive demands of a task are really valuable, for even in situations where we're teaching English as a subject. And whether that's the fact that we're teaching language with and through content, using the content that learners are coming in their other school subjects or in their other days of lives, whether that's more project-based learning, whether we're acknowledging the role of CLIL and EMI in a changing world and bilingual settings all around the world, or whether that's taking the work on mediation in the CEFR, which was the companion volume 2018, really focused on these developments in mediation that Chia mentioned yesterday, this whole set of scales now for talking about mediating texts between texts and learners, between learners and other learners, between our own opinions and our learners or the recipients of our language. All these particular scales here are essentially non-language skills. They're about talking about content. How do we make the content the most important focus of what we're relaying rather than the language development itself? So I think we need, as teachers, to be aware of this blurring of boundaries. And I think many of us, perhaps without consciously realizing it, are doing much more CLILling than we realize, reusing content from other school subjects, reusing content that's coming from learners' lives as part of the language development. And I think that's a positive thing. So, those are my 5 claims of things that I think are important challenges for learners to be aware of. And maybe yours are different, as I said, and it's absolutely fine. And hopefully you'll challenge some of these and put your own in there, the things that you think are professional development opportunities. But at the end of the day, and here's your final test, I think it's all about empowerment. So we've had a multiple choice test, so I thought we'd finish with a gap fill. Here's your gap fill task. Nice, easy one. I'm not even going to do feedback on this. correct answers here are the teacher understanding and critiquing the principles of the system. We heard about this yesterday. It's a political act, and it's also an empowerment act. Not a private soldier obeying, but an intelligent medium of action. I think conferences like this are where this happens. It's tempting to think this is my claim for the third decade of the 21st century, but actually, this takes us back to where we started from John Dewey 130 years ago. So my last words to you are, take this opportunity and the future opportunities to feel empowered, to make your own decisions about the competences that are appropriate for you in your professional development journey. Remember, it's down to you. Yeah? The educational system might not change without you. And so that responsibility lies with everyone in this room. And if you're feeling nervous about where you are on the bridge, I think the wisest character here is this one I've coloured in red. And I think this character is saying to the others on the bridge, hey everybody, over there's another bridge. Yeah? And that's where we are, and that's where we need to take ourselves on this professional development journey. It's been a pleasure talking to you. Thank you very much.